The ultimate goal of any training course is performance improvement. Understanding how memory works and designing e-learning courses accordingly is a big step towards that ultimate goal. If, at the end of the course, learners don't remember a single thing, then learning hasn't taken place, performance hasn't improved, and the course design was ineffective. Therefore, to design effective courses, you need to understand the characteristics of memory. In this lesson, we'll talk about the role memory plays in learning. We'll learn about long-term, short-term, and working memory. We'll also learn about George Miller's magical number and how it relates to learning and design. And finally, we'll talk about the cognitive load theory and things you can do to avoid cognitive load in your course design. According to George Miller's magical number 7 plus or minus 2, short-term memory is only able to hold about 7 bits of information. To ensure better retention, it is best to break lessons up so that they contain even fewer bits of information to ensure better retention. The exact amount of information provided in the course should depend on the content and its complexity. For instance, most people can remember numbers more easily than words. Therefore, if the course requires learners to memorize numbers, you can create lessons that contain as many as 7 pieces of information. On the other hand, if the lesson requires memorization or retention of terminology, smaller lessons featuring only 4 bits of information would be useful. Short-term memory refers to the temporary storage for manipulation and processing of information. Each time new information is presented, it is temporarily stored in the short-term memory. Thereafter, it can either be encoded into long-term memory or completely disappear from the memory. Whether or not learners retain the content from the lesson depends on the lesson design. Experienced instructional designers always aim to avoid cognitive overload and create interactive and memorable learning experiences. Information overload is a serious issue when it comes to learning. Here's an example. John is a medical student. Right before his exam, he stayed up all night and crammed all the information. Needless to say, soon after the exam, he forgot everything he learned the night before. When John graduates from medical school, do you think he will be able to accurately diagnose his patients? Well, probably not. Today, many organizations want instructional designers to create quick training solutions for their employees. Most of the time, clients are set on a specific type of training without ever realizing that there are better solutions to their problem. Keep in mind that most stakeholders don't know much about effective instructional design principles, and the only desire they have is to reach their ultimate goal, which is to improve their employees' performance. Performance improvement can mean increased sales, better customer service, or anything else specific to that organization. As instructional designers, we need to create instructionally sound solutions that help learners retain the information and become better performers. When you design learning experiences, there are 3 types of cognitive loads that should be considered. These types are intrinsic load, germane load, and extraneous load. To maximize learning efficiency, you, as an instructional designer, should find a good balance between all 3 of these loads. The first one is an intrinsic load. It's determined by instructional goals and elements of interactivity. Let me give you an example. Let's assume you're teaching French and you want your students to learn vocabulary. The element of interactivity is low. Therefore, the intrinsic load is also low. Remember the 7 plus or minus 2 rule, and keep in mind that shorter words are easier to remember, while longer words may require greater effort from your learners. After learners memorize the words, they can begin constructing sentences using these words. In addition to retrieving the newly acquired words from memory, your learners will have to apply what they know about sentence structure and grammar in French. Now, learners know vocabulary words and can construct sentences. The next goal is to have them carry out a conversation in French using correct vocabulary, sentence structure, and grammar. At this point, the intrinsic cognitive load becomes even greater as the learner has to be able to understand the question quickly and come up with the answer in French using appropriate vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation. As a result, the element of interactivity becomes significantly higher. What does this mean for you, the instructional designer? Simply put, in order for your lesson to be effective, it needs to be split into small segments, creating a number of relevant prerequisite tasks and distributing them over the lessons can help instructional designers break information into manageable pieces. Now, let's move on to the germane load. The germane load is the demand placed on short-term memory while the learner obtains new knowledge and skills. It's one of the most effective cognitive loads primarily because it requires learners to successfully construct schema. A schema is a term that describes structures that organize our knowledge about something for interpreting and processing information. The third and last type of cognitive load is the extraneous load, also known as irrelevant load. It refers to unnecessary information that wastes mental resources. Everything that distracts learners from the main objective is part of the extraneous load. Now that you know how short-term memory applies to e-learning, let's talk about the long-term memory. Long-term memory is the target destination where newly acquired knowledge assimilates. The information is stored permanently here. One of the main roles of long-term memory is providing the background information needed to understand new concepts. This is done through the retrieval of appropriate information from long-term memory into short-term memory. Encoding, storage, and retrieval are the three operations that long-term memory performs. Encoding is when new information is transferred to long-term memory. Storage is when the information is stored into long-term memory. And retrieval is when the information is actually activated and used. So, what are some of the ways to enhance encoding and retrieval of information from the long-term memory? The answer is simple. Repetition, repetition, repetition. You should structure your courses so that they force learners to tie the information together and create mental images of the information. Distribute practice activities throughout the lesson as opposed to placing them at the end of the module. If the course is separated into multiple chunks, offer practice in each module to help learners put information into perspective. Some of the best ways to repeat important points from the lesson include showing a video that explains the concept, adding a case study or a skit to the lesson, presenting the information in the form of a graph, and paraphrasing or finding another way to explain the same idea. Another way to ensure the information presented in the course makes its way to the long-term memory is by offering quizzes and self-checks throughout the course. Application is key to successful retention. Quizzes should give learners a chance to apply their knowledge and recall information from the lesson. Adding short, check your knowledge quizzes after each section of the course, as opposed to offering a long test at the end of the course, helps with long-term retention. I know we've covered a lot of information here, so let's see how you can apply it. Taking George Miller's magical number and short-term memory into consideration, how will you ensure that your learners retain the content presented in the course? Also, how will you find balance between the intrinsic, germane, and extraneous loads? Remember that finding a balance between all three types of cognitive loads is key to effective course design. However, you should aim towards maximizing the germane cognitive load and minimizing the extraneous or irrelevant cognitive load. Here's one suggestion. When designing courses, try to focus primarily on objectives and avoid adding filler information. One way to lower the cognitive load is to remove irrelevant visual elements. Also, break information into meaningful portions less than 30 minutes in length. If there is a lot of the must-know content, spreading it through different modules or lessons can be beneficial. When you create simulations or multiple-choice questions, limiting the number of options is your best bet. This will eliminate unnecessary mental work for learners and consequently lower their cognitive load. It is also highly recommended you divide content into beginning and expert-level sections. This way, the expert-level learners will not have to go through basic information that they already know and extensive examples that increase their cognitive load. At the same time, novice learners will get the necessary exposure to step-by-step explanations and examples.